The year is 1922, and after 850 years of colonial oppression at the hands of our neighbours, after having our language and our culture stripped from us, after the Black and Tans brutalised people in this country, and after the forced starvation of millions of people and the mass exodus of millions more, Ireland is finally granted her independence. You can only imagine the joy that that must have brought, the hope for a new beginning. And there was definitely an element of that. There was a real drive in the country by Eamon de Valera, to name just one proponent, of reinvigorating Irish culture, Irish heritage, Irish mythology, and our ancestry in an effort to rebuild a national identity. But the sad truth was that although we had rid the country of our British oppressors, another evil, malevolent force was quickly gaining power in this country. And that force was the Catholic Church. This is the story of the Magdalene Laundries. The Magdalene Laundries were initially set up in the 1800s, and they were named for Mary Magdalene, who is known as a sex worker both colloquially and in the Catholic Church. Now, this is despite the fact that there is zero mention of her being a sex worker literally anywhere in the Bible, and it is very likely down to a mistake made by one pope at one time during one sermon that then spread through Western Catholicism. Now, the true nature of Mary Magdalene is very likely that she was just an apostle of Jesus Christ. But I suppose what can you expect from a patriarchal structure such as the Catholic Church to allow for a woman to be an apostle of Jesus Christ? I suppose just wouldn't do. The reason Magdalene Laundries were named for Mary Magdalene is because they were originally set up to house, rehabilitate, and financially stabilise sex workers. They were a social system of sorts and something of a charity to begin with. But with good intentions ultimately comes a fall. By the time Ireland became an independent state in 1922, the Magdalene Laundries had started taking a bit of a turn. To understand fully the context of the Magdalene Laundries and the power that the Catholic Church held in Ireland at the time, we need to go back a little bit. Something that happened almost immediately after we gained our independence from the UK was that the state, and Eamon de Valera in particular, wanted to build and focus on a national identity. And this wasn't all bad. It caused a revival of our mythology. It looked into our Celtic art and rediscovered our Celtic roots. And this was all in an attempt to be something distinctly not English. Unfortunately, something that had grown as a great opposition to the English and had become really incredibly intertwined with Irish identity was Catholicism. And there's a strong reason for that. During the colonisation of Ireland, England became a Protestant country. And by the way, that wasn't always the case, because in the beginning, in the 12th century, England was originally given quote-unquote permission to invade Ireland and colonise Ireland and rule Ireland under the condition that England would bring the Roman Catholic Church to Ireland. Ireland at the time was already practicing Christianity, but it was practicing a monastic style of Christianity, and the Roman Catholic Church didn't like that. So in the 12th century, the at the time British Pope advised King Henry II that he gave him his permission to rule Ireland and become King of Ireland, so long as he brought this Roman Catholicism into the country. So it was actually the British who brought this kind of Roman Catholicism into the country in the beginning, because we were quite happy with our monastic Christianity, which was a much, I suppose, gentler Christianity than what we would come to see from the Catholic Church. Our monastic Christianity incorporated and kind of absorbed Celtic mythology, Celtic art, and pagan practices, quite frankly. I just did a video on the witch trials of Ireland, or lack thereof, and one of the reasons that we didn't really participate in the witch trials was because of our pagan beliefs that witches were ultimately good and that it was the fairies really that you had to look out for. And one of the reasons that those beliefs lasted up until the point of the witch trials that were spreading like wildfire across Europe, pardon the pun, is because the Christian church, the early Christian church in Ireland, was quite accepting of our pagan ways. So witches and magical women were not vilified. But that did, of course, all change. We could have been a very different country indeed if we had just been left to our own devices, but I digress. So King Henry II invades Ireland and he brings Roman's Catholicism along with him. That meant that Ireland became a lot more aligned with the Roman Catholic Church and ultimately English Catholic Church as well. And then, of course, as we all know, another Henry, Henry V, converted England to Protestantism. And the reason that he did that, or so the story goes, is because he wanted to be able to divorce. And what happened then, of course, to put things very simply, is that the British rule in Ireland were Protestant and the local native Irish people were Catholic, and that created, of course, a rift. It's not that the religions themselves created a rift. I mean, they're essentially the same religion, but Protestantism became one and the same with being English, and Catholicism became one and the same with being Catholic. There are even parts of Catholic history in Ireland where the Catholic Church went a certain way in helping to revive the Irish language. So it wasn't all bad, but what it did mean is that when it came to our independence in 1922, Ireland was a staunchly Catholic country, and being Catholic meant being Irish, and it also meant that being Catholic was part of this new Irish identity. It was part of being nationalistic and proud of being who you were. So along with the endeavours to kind of revive our Celtic history, our Celtic art and our Celtic heritage, Catholicism too had a stronghold on this new story of Irish identity, because quite frankly it had already gotten its teeth in. And that brings us to the Magdalene Laundries. Now, the Magdalene Laundries were actually set up in the 18th century, and what they were houses for sex workers, effectively, where they could go and seek refuge and rid themselves of the sin that they had committed through labour. But they were given a small amount of money for that labour as well. So these were facilities that were started with good intention. By the time that the Irish Free State was formed, the idea of fallen women was expanded from just sex workers to encompass a whole host of other types of women. Predominantly women who had children out of wedlock were considered fallen women, because that was, of course, the ultimate sin. For women, that is, not for men. There were no such laundries for men. Funny that, isn't it? Anyway, one of the main crimes that you could commit that would land you in a Magdalene laundry would be having a child out of wedlock. But that wasn't the only crime you could commit. You could also be sexually assaulted or raped, and that would also land you in a laundry. You could also, at one of the more extreme ends of the spectrum, just simply be too pretty or at risk of falling away. So the sheer risk that you might have sex outside of wedlock, or that you might have a child outside of wedlock, became enough to imprison you in a system like the Magdalene Laundries. One of the things that would often happen, and a very, very common story in Ireland at this time, was that a woman would fall pregnant outside of wedlock and go to a mother and baby home, which was also facilitated by the church, predominantly by the nuns, who held an exorbitant amount of power at the time. And that woman, or oftentimes child really, would give birth to her child, she would be let out of the mother and baby home. And I'll be working on a video about mother and baby homes as well, so do comment below if you'd like to see that. She would be let out of the mother and baby home, oftentimes without her baby, and if her family took her back in, then great, the whole ordeal was over to one degree or another. But what you have to remember is that culturally at the time, having a baby outside of wedlock was an incredibly shameful thing for a woman to do, and for a woman to, quote, put her family through. So what often happened upon returning home is these women would be turned away by their own families and sent to a Magdalene laundry. Now, upon entering a Magdalene laundry, these women were stripped of their humanity. Their names were taken from them and they were given different names. They were not allowed to speak to other women within the laundry while they were working. And ultimately, what these laundries were laundries. They were laundrettes where local businesses, the state, and the church would send their laundry to get cleaned and ironed and prepared. And these women did not see a penny of the money that those laundries were making off their backs. Not only were these women not making any money, but it can't be overstated that these women were imprisoned. They were enslaved in these laundries. They were not able to leave. The only times that these women were allowed to leave was when a male relative signed them out, or if they were lucky enough to escape. It can't be understated either the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that a lot of these women suffered through at the hands of nuns and priests while imprisoned in these laundries. Women report being stripped, sexually assaulted, physically beaten, and emotionally abused, being called ugly, having their hair cut and shaved off, and effectively having all their humanity stripped from them. Martha Cooney, who's one of the incredible women that's interviewed in the documentary Sex in a Cold Climate, recounts that she was sexually assaulted by her cousin, and when her family found out, they sent her to one of these laundries for the sheer shame of it. And her story is recounted in The Magdalene Sisters, which is an excellent movie. And she, upon being sexually assaulted in the laundry by a priest, famously told him, "You are not a man of God." And that is echoed in the film The Magdalene Sisters by the actress Eileen Walsh, who gave an incredible performance and also co-starred in Cillian Murphy's latest film, Small Things Like These. What's interesting, I think, about both of these movies is that they show two extremely different sides of the Magdalene laundries. One, The Magdalene Sisters, gives a real inward perspective on what it was like within the laundries themselves. There's another character who again is based on a real person who was imprisoned in the laundry because she was too pretty and she was at risk of falling, like I mentioned earlier. Small Things Like These then really speaks more to the societal norms at the time. There's a song, I can't stress this enough, there's a song in Small Things Like These, and it's I forget the song, but it's a relatively recent one from the 80s. This is recent history in Ireland. The last of the Magdalene laundries closed in 1996. I was 5 years old when the last of these laundries closed. This is extremely recent history. But Small Things Like These doesn't so much delve into the life and the horrors within the laundries, but it looks more at the social structure at the time and how these laundries were allowed to happen. So you had this environment where, one, the Catholic Church had a huge amount of wealth and power in the country, and they were also, like I say, very much interlinked with Irish national identity, and frankly they ran everything. The Catholic Church and the state were technically separate, but in practice they really weren't. The Catholic Church ran everything from orphanages to schools to hospitals, and they had their fingers in all of the pies. They had their fingers in politics as well. They were, I cannot stress this enough, extremely powerful and extremely influential. And in small things like these, we see a little bit of that. So Cillian Murphy's character challenges at times. He challenges the nuns in one of these laundries, and he is very quickly threatened. His livelihood is threatened, the schooling of his daughters is threatened as well. And that was the context that these were set up in. It's very easy to say, I think, that people allowed it to happen. Ireland was an extremely poor country. People were extremely poor because of how colonialism absolutely decimated this country. Our population was gone. It had completely dwindled. We were left extremely impoverished, and all anyone could really do was survive. So to say that people should have stood up and people should have fought back against it, you would have been fighting one of the most powerful structures in the country. In recent history, though, I think what's really happened is a lot of this stuff has had a light shone on it. We have shone a light on the Magdalene Laundries. We know now that approximately 10,000 women were sent to these laundries. We know that many of them spent 40, 50, even 60 years in these laundries. Many of them died in these laundries. We know that now, and we still don't know the full extent because it wasn't fully documented, because the church wasn't beholden to anyone. We also know that close to 60,000 babies were born in mother and baby homes in Ireland as well. And many of those babies died, approximately 10,000 of them, because they were so malnourished and so mistreated. We also know, and again I'll do a video about it, but we also know that the Catholic Church sold many of these babies. And it's not an uncommon story that a woman would give birth to a baby, want to keep the baby, and not be allowed to keep that baby. And then of course you had the mother and baby home of Toom and the mass grave that was found there of babies that had been buried in an unmarked grave. An absolutely atrocious discovery. In 2013, the then Taoiseach of Ireland, the kind of Prime Minister, so to speak, Enda Kenny, apologised for the Magdalene Laundries on behalf of the Irish state. The Catholic Church is yet to issue an apology for these laundries. And I think that, along with mother and baby homes, along with the child abuse, the child sexual abuse that happened in this country, I think those are all reasons that Ireland has very quickly and very suddenly moved away from being a once extremely religious country to not really religious at all. I, for one, have a lot of friends and acquaintances who don't identify as religious. I know so many of my friends are opting out of Catholic marriages and are doing pagan ceremonies for marriages instead. So deep and entwined was this culture of religiosity that I, for example, made my confirmation while I was in Taiwan. I was not religious, my parents weren't religious, but we were culturally Catholic. I was going to an international school at the time. I was 12 years old. None of my friends were having their confirmation done. I had to take time out on the weekends to go to this church and get my confirmation. And one of the reasons that my parents would always kind of cite was if I didn't have my confirmation, I wouldn't be able to get married in a Catholic church. And these were two people who didn't go to church. So there really was this massively cultural element to Catholicism in Ireland. It very much was part of our national identity. It wasn't only a religion. But a lot of us have rejected it. A lot of us are moving back to more kind of pagan beliefs and practices, and that's something I talk a lot about here, obviously, and on my TikTok and Substack as well. In fact, on the Substack book club at the moment, we're doing a book called Old Ways, Old Secrets by Joe Kerrigan, and it's about pagan Ireland. So druids, fairies, the Tuatha Dé Danann. It is fascinating. On the 1st of December, we're going to move on to a new book called A History of Irish Magic, which I just bought recently. It's an expensive book. It's €66 for the hardback, 33 for the softback, but it is so well written and so full of it's just bursting with information about Ireland's kind of old magical history. And I cannot wait to delve into that one. But yeah, all of that to say that I think Ireland is becoming a much more progressive country very, very quickly. In 2016, we voted in favour of marriage equality, which effectively was in favour of same-sex couples getting married. And in 2018, we voted to repeal the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment was a law in place that made it illegal to get an abortion in Ireland, and that is another absolutely sordid history that we have in this country that killed countless women and really traumatized countless others. So yeah, I don't know what point I'm trying to make, but I suppose horrible and horrid as that history is, there is some progress that has come from it. Something that really worries me is the uptick in political movements and political parties like Aontú, who are an anti-choice party. I think with our history, it would just be shameful for us to see a party like that in government, and they are gaining popularity, I think, because of their anti-immigration stance, which is absolutely tragic. So I would encourage you, I suppose, to get out and vote. We certainly don't have to agree on politics, but voting is so extremely important, because that's what gets things like these changed. That all got a little bit rambly there towards the end, but I would like to close out with a massive thank you for the support for this channel. I think we've got close to 50 followers now on YouTube, and I was really happy with the response in the last video. I linked the book club down below as well if you're interested in that, and if you would like to support me, that's one way of doing it. Thank you so much again for being here. Gur míle maith agat agus slán go fóill.